Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. In this exercise 46, we're going to create a project skeleton, which we can use when we create new projects. And that will include the basic layout of our project, some automated tests, modules that we can work with, and also a structure to include our scripts. So that can be very handy because it provides a good starting point to create new projects. And to get started, we can install and set up the required modules in order to create our project skeleton. And here we have separate instructions for macOS or Linux and also for Windows. So if you're using Windows, feel free to skip ahead to the Windows installation instructions. First of all, in order to start installing our modules, we need to make sure that we have a software tool called pip installed, specifically pip 3.6, and that's generally installed along with the version of Python that we installed before. But let's make sure that we actually install the proper version by typing in pip 3.6 list, and that should then list the version of pip that we're using and also setup tools. So let's open up our terminal and let's type in pip 3.6 list. And then we can see a list of results, and here we can see pip, and we can also see setup tools, which is listed here. So with that out of the way, we basically have the requirements to install the different modules that we are going to work with. And the first step that we're going to take is to install a virtual environment, so that we can also handle different versions of the modules that we're working with, especially if we're working with different projects that might be using different versions of those modules. So to install the virtual environment, virtualenv, we can type in sudo pip 3.6 install virtualenv, and we can confirm this. It will then ask us for the password, our admin password, to install that virtual environment. Now, I already did that ahead of time, so I'm not gonna enter the command in here. But once it's executed, you will see a success message here at the end that the latest version of virtualenv has been installed. We can also check that we are using the correct virtualenv by typing in where is followed by virtualenv. So if we do that, it might happen actually when you run that you don't get any output here, and the reason is that where is, this command is only searching certain directories. If virtualenv is installed in a different directory, what you can do instead is type in which virtualenv, and that should give you back the correct path here. So either way is fine. Now once we've done that, we installed our virtual environment here, and now we can basically create a fake Python installation, and that's going to make it easier to manage versions of packages for different projects, especially if you're using different versions of those packages. So what we're going to do now is we first of all are going to create a directory here called venvs in our home directory to store all our virtual environments. So that means we would go ahead and type in make directory, mkdir. Then we can type in the tilde character followed by a / .venvs. And if you type enter, that should create a new directory. I already created that directory, therefore I'm getting that message. But after that, you can, in the next step, enter in this command here. And what that is going to do is it's going to run virtualenv and tell it to include the system side packages, which is basically that argument that we are passing in here. And then it will instruct it to build the virtual environment in this particular path here. So that is basically being created. Next, we are going to execute this command here. So dot followed by a space, tilde, and then this path here basically. And what we are doing here is we are sourcing the Learn Python the Hard Way virtual environment by using the dot operator in bash, followed by basically this activate script here. And once we execute that, then our prompt is going to change, and it's going to look something like this here. That means we are basically inside of our virtual environment. And it's not that important to understand those commands here in detail. We just need to run them once to basically execute those commands and set up our virtual environment. Now, once we've done that and we are inside of our virtual environment here, we can now see where the different programs are being installed. So if we first of all check for Python, and we type in which Python, we can now see it is actually installed inside of our virtual environment that we set up. And if we now type in Python, we also switch into our Python terminal here, or the Python interpreter. And of course you can type in quit and press enter to switch out of that again back to our terminal. Alright, once we've done that, we need to install one more module, and that is a testing framework that we're going to use, which is called Nose. So here we need to enter in the command pip, because we are using that again, install Nose, and press enter, and then you're going to be guided through the steps to install the latest version of Nose, which we are going to use going forward. I already installed that, so I'm not going to execute that command, but these are the basic setup steps that we need to do. At least for macOS or Linux. If you're using Windows 10 instead, you will find the instructions here. So actually the Windows 10 install is a little bit simpler than the one for Linux or macOS. And what you need to do is you need to basically first change your directory using the tilde character here, check that you have the right version of Python installed, and then you can run the pip command to have the basic install here, or basically to check that you have the right version of pip installed here. After that, we would install the virtual environment again using this command here. And once we have installed our virtual environment, we then of course also need to create our directory here. And that works as follows. We would type in mkdir space .venvs to set this up. And after that, of course, again, we need to basically configure that using here our system side packages command. And that again sets up that fake environment, that virtual environment that we're going to use in order to manage different versions of the different modules we're working with. And finally, we need to activate that environment by typing out this command here, and that will run the activate script for PowerShell, which then configures our virtual environment for us in the current shell. And finally, we need to install Nose, the testing framework that we're going to use. So we type out pip install Nose, and then we should have the latest version of pip install. Alright, once we have installed those modules, either for macOS, Linux, or for Windows, we can then create the skeleton for our project directory. And to do that, first of all, we want to create a new projects directory. So we can again type in mkdir space projects to create that directory. And then we can, once we have done that, we can switch over to the projects directory. And we want to create inside of the projects directory a second directory called skeleton. And then by typing in cd skeleton, we change the directory over to the skeleton directory. And then we're going to create a number of different directories here: bin, name, tests, and docs. So we type out mkdir space bin, space name, which is in all caps, space tests, space docs, and confirm, and that would create those directories for us. And then if we type out ls, we should basically see that basic structure here of the different directories that we just created. So we are going to use that projects directory here to store all the various elements that we are working on, and inside of that we just created the skeleton directory, and inside of that we basically put the basis of our projects in. And then the name, the directory called name, it's basically a placeholder name. We would then replace that name with the actual name of our project that we're working on. Next, we need to set up some initial files that we're going to use. So if we are working on Linux or Mac OS, then we type out touch space name / and then underscore init __ .py, which basically creates a new init Python file inside of the name directory that we set up. And we follow the same steps basically for the tests directory. So here we are also going to create an init file that we create, and that of course later on we can adjust. If instead you are working on Windows, then you can use PowerShell to type out those commands here, which have the same effect, so that you basically create those empty files, the Python files that we can then specify further. Now, of course, we need to provide some information inside of the Python files that we just created. So first of all, we actually create an additional file called setup.py that we can use to install our project later if we want. So to do that, we can head back to our terminal. We should make sure that we are inside of our skeleton directory here, and then we can create a new file called setup.py. So I'm using Visual Studio Code, so I'm typing out code space setup.py, and that's going to create a new Python file called setup. And then of course we would make sure to include this information here. So we have some configuration option included in there, and we also have a try and exception clause here to basically set this up properly. And I already typed that out ahead of time. Here in the config dictionary that we created, we include information such as the name for our project, the author, URL, and for example also the packages we are going to include. And of course we would adjust that later on when we create our own projects. We would basically fill in the information for our projects. So it's important to create that particular file. And finally, we want to have a simple skeleton file for the tests here, named test/name _ tests.py. So again, we can switch back to our terminal and type in cd to change our directory. We want to switch over to the tests directory, and inside of that we can then create a new file called name _ tests.py. And we want to make sure that we include the information precisely as it's stated here. So we have 3 different functions in here: setup, teardown, and test basic. And we need to make sure that we included the information just as stated here. Once we have done all of that, we should basically have this kind of structure. We have the skeleton directory on top. Below that we have those 4 subdirectories: name, bin, docs, and tests. We also have the setup.py file that we just created before, and inside of name we should have that init.py file, and inside of tests we have that init.py file that we created initially, but also the name _ tests.py file that we created just up here. And to check that, we can of course switch back to our terminal. We can either, if we switch up again, type ls, which will basically give us back all the files included in this case inside of the skeleton directory, so name, bin, docs, setup.py and tests. Or there's also a separate tool that we can install called tree, which basically gives us this nice overview of the directory and the different subdirectories or files inside of the directories. And if we switch back one level up by typing in cd space ... we are now on the projects level. And if we type tree again, then we can see we have the skeleton directory here, the name directory below that, and it's basically the exact same structure that we have here. Alright, and now we want to actually make sure that it works properly. So here we're going to check out if Nose, the testing framework that we installed, actually works properly. And here it's very important to be in the right directory before we are actually running those tests. So we need to make sure that we are above the tests directory. So if I switch back to skeleton, we need to make sure that we are inside of our skeleton directory, which we can also check by typing in pwd, which stands for present working directory. Here we are inside of skeleton. It's important to not be inside of the tests directory, because we need to basically be one level up. So we type in cd ... to be up one level, and if we type out ls, we should be able to actually see the test directory, because that's just below the current directory. And now let's type in nose tests, which is basically going to run our test directory. So here we can see that again. If we type out ls, we should see this directory structure here with a tests folder in it. And now we type in nose tests. And ideally we should get this back so that we ran one test and status is okay. Now it might happen that you actually get an error message here. What may happen is that Nose, the testing framework we are using, is trying to use an older Python version, specifically Python 2. If that happens, there's a warning here. In that case, you could either change the Python version used by Nose, which you could do by, for example, running pip3 install Nose again, or what's even easier and better in this case is to run Python 3.6 -m nose on Linux, or on Windows Python -m nose, and that should solve the issue. So we would on Mac or Linux type out this command here, and then it should run this properly, and nose test should now give back the status okay. Alright, now we basically set up all the required steps. So this was testing our setup. If everything works properly, if we run nose tests, we should get back when one test in this amount of time, status okay. So basically this output here, that means we set it up properly and we can start using it for the projects we're going to work on going forward. And actually we're going to take a closer look at nose tests in the next exercise that we're going to work on. For now we just need to make sure that it's configured properly and that we get back the proper result here. Now once we set up our project skeleton structure, one exercise is here to actually start using it. So in order to use it, we need to follow these steps here. First of all, we want to make a copy of the skeleton directory, and we should name it after the project we are working on. So we can do that directly from our terminal. If we switch back one level above the skeleton directory, so basically inside of our projects directory, we can type out ls, and we see our skeleton directory here, basically with the template information. Now in order to make a copy of our skeleton directory and start using it within a project, we can type in cp for copy. Then we want to make sure that we copy the skeleton directory, and of course we want to include the name of the new project that we're working on. So we can, for example, just call it, let's say, project 1. Oh, and we need to make sure to do that recursively, so we copy the information included in the skeleton directory. So we need to type in cp-r skeleton and then the project name, for example, project1. Now if that worked properly, we can type in ls and we should now see project1 added in here. And of course, instead of doing that here from the terminal, you can of course also just copy that using the user interface, for example, from the file directory or from the Explorer. Now to switch inside of our newly created project directory, just type in cd project1. And let's check that it actually includes the same information by typing in ls. And here again, we see the different folders that we created before, the different directories, name, bin, docs, and tests, and also setup.py. Now, the next step here is to edit our setup.py file to have all the information for our project. So here again, we can, for example, use Visual Studio Code by typing out code space setup.py. And that's going to open up that setup.py file, but now inside of our project directory that we are working with. And here we can adjust the configuration, so we would include the description of our project. So we can say, for example, project1 project that we are working on, our name, the URL, download URL, our email, and also the packages we are working with. And actually what we are going to do in one of the next steps is actually to change the name of our directory here, so of name itself. So here we can, for example, change that to, let's call it project1, and then save that change. What we also can do here is we can change the name of the name directory here. So we can basically type in move or mv, and then we're gonna rename the name directory, for example, to project1. Type enter, and if we type out ls again, now we see we now have project1 included in here. We already set up our setup.py file here, and now we can rename tests/name test.py to use our module name as well. So here we can switch over to the tests directory. Here we still have name_test.py included. So again, we can use move or mv to actually rename name_test.py, for example, to project1_tests.py. And let's go back up, and if we didn't make a mistake, then nose tests should still work properly. Now we're getting an error message here inside of project1_tests.py. Import name is leading to an error. So we still need to rename that. So if we go to the tests directory and we open up project1_tests.py, let's just take a look at that file. And here we see we are importing name, which is, if we just take a look at the structure again, which was the name directory that we now renamed to project1. Therefore we're getting that error message. We also need to make sure to rename that here to project1 and save that change. Now let's check that again. If we run nose tests, now we get back that we ran the one test and status is okay. So we set up the structure here, and now of course we can start coding, start working on our new project that we're working on. And we can just repeat those steps for each new project we are creating. And the benefit here is that we don't have to create that structure over and over again. We can just copy it over. We already have our automated tests included. We have our structure in place, and we can just rename it and start working on the project. So that's the setup that we needed to do. And in the next exercise, we are going to dive a little bit deeper into the specifics of working with nose and running automated tests. So the quiz here, this time we don't have a study drill section, but a quiz that we should complete. It's really about understanding what we have done so far. So here we should read about all the things that we have installed. For example, using pip to install nose as an example, to read about the setup file, to make a project and start putting code into the module. That's basically what we just did, to copy over the project structure, and then of course we can start coding and get the modules to work. And I'm also going to reference some additional resources about the different tools that we've been using, like pip for example, or nose, so feel free to check out those links. Finally, let's take a look at some common student questions. So first of all, do these instructions work on Windows? They should. You can go back and take a look at the instructions on how to install, for example, nose on Windows. You may struggle a little bit depending on the version of Windows you're using. In this case, you may need to Google a bit and research to get it to work. So what do we put in the config dictionary in setup.py? So here we have some further information. I'm going to also link that in the description below. This is some of the documentation that's important for that. So if we can't load the name module and we just get an import error, what should we do? We should make sure that we created the name file here and the init file just below the name file. If you're on Windows, we need to make sure that we didn't accidentally have the wrong file name here, so .txt instead of py. Of course, it needs to be py in order for it to be a Python file. Why do we need a bin folder that we created below our skeleton dictionary? This is just a standard place to put scripts that are run on the command line, but not a place to put modules. So it helps us to really set up our project a little bit nicer. So when we run nose tests, which we did before, it shows only one test being run. Is that correct? So that's correct at this point in time. We didn't really set up any specific tests yet. That's what we're going to do in the following exercise. So that's it for exercise 46, and see you guys in the next video with exercise 47.